it was fun to watch. I was looking around and I saw people singing along with that song. Got some Hootie fans out there. That's nice. I was listening. Of course, I'm reading these lyrics and I'm listening to this great song, and then I'm thinking, he's got it all wrong. But it's not wrong. I mean, it's how we feel, but we really give time way too much credit. We give it way too much responsibility and credit for who we are instead of just being who we are. Who's really wasting time? Time's not wasting our time. Time's not taking us down the wrong path. So it's really an interesting idea that we have towards time, I think, and so I hope you'll play with me a little bit as we do sometimes we do these sermons, and I realize that these sermons are more thought experiments than they are really sermons, right? I'm sort of introducing ideas, and we're all thinking about them, hopefully, and then we take it away from here, and we think what this all means. But in particular, I wanted to think about this idea of time because I've been reading this wonderful book by Carlo Rovelli, who was the guy who wrote this book called The 7 Lessons from Physics, something like that, and it was a national bestseller, and he's an Italian physicist. And he's the guy that developed a theory to sort of equate relativity theory with quantum mechanics, because there's some kind of contradiction there between relativity theory and quantum mechanics for all of you quantum scientists out there. That's all I know. I don't know anything else about it. But there's a problem, apparently. They don't reconcile with each other. So he developed a theory that reconciles the two of them, at least one theory, and so he's best known for that. But he has a great book called Order of Time, and it's not too long, it's not too big, it's a small, thin volume. It's really fascinating to read. So I want to get to a couple of ideas that he shares that I think really illuminate, these ancient scriptures and texts that we read this morning, as well as our songs. But first, I want to tell you a story about my day yesterday. Yesterday, I was getting ready about 12:45. I just got through having a nice walk with Linda in the morning. We try to do walks on Saturdays. We take a little bit longer walk, and Linda had to be at Emily's house, at our granddaughter's, because she was going to babysit our youngest granddaughter, our 11-month-old, and Maeve, and then Emily and daughter Molly were going with some of their family to the stock show, which started at 2 o'clock. So Linda was supposed to be at Emily's house at 1 o'clock to babysit, and it's 12:45, and we got back from the walk about 12:30. And then I remembered I'm supposed to have 2 packages that are overdue because I'm getting notices and I'm selling some things on Amazon, and it's like, okay, you're 4 days overdue for shipping these things out. And Linda's going, you're going to get a bad rating. And so I'm like, oh my God, how late is the post office open? So 3 miles away, it's open till 1 o'clock. It's 12:45. I run upstairs, grab envelopes, and she says, Tom, you're parked behind me. I can't get out. So all of this chaos is going on around, I've got to get out and get to the post office before 1 o'clock. Finally get it all together. It's 12:51. And I'm running out the door as Matthew's coming in the door with Eleanor, who's crying, and he has her for the afternoon, and he says, do we have any diapers anywhere? And Linda's going, I got to get out the door, and I'm heading out behind her, and Eleanor's crying, and he says, is there anything to eat? And I say, try the kitchen, and he says, for the diapers? And I'm in my car. And so I'm driving with intentionality and determination, and down Hewlin Street to the Trinity Post Office. And I get there. It's 12:58. And I get through the door, which is open, but there's 2 clerks standing there, and they're working with a line. There's about 5 people. And it comes down, and right at about 1 o'clock, I step up with my 2 packages, and a woman comes in through the door, and one of the clerks says, we're closed. But there's still 3 people in line behind me, 2 people at the counter, and the door's open. And I realize these postal workers have been working now for, up until yesterday, working for a month without pay. So I'm not trying to judge them or anything like that. They've had a hard enough time. And so I just smile, and the woman looked over, and she said, but the door's open. And she said, that's because I haven't had time to get it closed. But we're closed. But there's people that we're closed. And so I looked at the guy, and I said, what if I just let her have my place? What if I did that? And he said, really? And the woman over beside him said, look, it's 7 o'clock somewhere else. It's 12 o'clock somewhere else. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the other side in the morning on the other side of the country. She said, get your business done, and then we're closing up. And I said, fine. And the guy looked at me and said, do you want your receipt? And I took my receipt, and the other woman had to leave. Closed the door. She got away. She closed the door behind me. And as I was walking to my car, I was getting in the car. It was now 10 after 1. I saw a guy with a massive package walking toward the door. And I just thought, should I tell him? But he got up to the door before I could stop him. It's interesting, this idea of how we struggle with time, and time is sort of like something we live by. I live by it in here. I want to make sure we get out of here close to noon. And God forbid that there's a Cowboy game happening afterwards, right? Or maybe you got to be somewhere for lunch. We operate under this idea of time always around us and running kind of our lives. We say it runs our lives, in fact. But it was interesting as I started doing this, because you know what the most frequently used word in the English language is? Well, I've already given it away. It's time. We'll say time more often in the day than we'll say any other word. And we won't even think about it, right? And yet we allow this concept to run our life, to kind of direct us. So how many, just to see, just for fun, real quick, I'm just going to ask you to shoot them out here. Just some of the phrases that you came up with for time. Time is eternal. Time flies. Time is precious. What back here? Time is money. Oh, that's a big one. Time out. Time is what? Time is ethereal. Okay. Like that. Ooh. Time is now. Time what? Oh, time heals everything. Time heals all wounds. Don't we hear that? Yeah. What if I told you there's no such thing as time? You're stuck now. Not really, but that's what we think sometimes, right? What? Good time? Good time. Yeah. What? Does anybody know what time it is? Does anybody really care? What else, Larry? Time for work. Time's up. Okay, anything else? Love is an abstract. And one more back here I heard. I'm sorry? Let the good times roll. Yeah. And time after time. So we have these ideas that we have all these phrases. There are actually, if you look up online, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of phrases that we have associated with time. And time is this thing that, again, it rules our life, and yet it is something that is not really a thing. The best we can come by understanding time in any kind of structured sense that's given, that is sort of an automatic, that is sort of there in our nature, is the fact that we have a heart that beats at certain paces, and then we live in the context of seasons. And so we have this great text from the wisdom literature, it's 2,500 years old, that talks about the seasons turn. There's a time for everything. But even that is up for question, I think, because even then we're giving ourselves over to something that's not really there. And it's more of an issue of being conscious. So Carlo Rovelli has this great book that he wrote, and he talks about this idea that in traditional science, in 18th century science, we thought of everything in terms of as material. And then 19th century science and 20th century science sort of took it further, and then we had Einstein early in the 20th century coming up with this idea that things are relative in relation to one another. But there's still this idea of material, right? Stuff. Things are things. This microphone's a microphone. The bread's a bread. My body's a thing, right? But then quantum mechanics came along because relatively didn't explain everything, and quantum mechanics became this theory that, well, maybe there's stuff that we don't know, that in fact, the more we get into the heart of things, the more we get into subatomic particles, the more we realize most everything, we talked about this last week, most everything is empty space. We're 99% empty, which explains a lot of things. but we live in this kind of emptiness. And yet it's not as though nothing's there. It's that we don't know what's there at this point. So Carlo Rovelli came up with this interesting theory, which most scientists now understand is true. He noticed at the subatomic level, you don't see electrons until they interact. Electrons seem to be leaping around, but you don't actually see them until they connect, until they interact with something, with a proton or something else. You don't see them actually in that space. And it got him to thinking philosophically about this idea of time and reality. We think of time as moving, And we say, well, obviously we live in time because I'm getting older, and now I'm older still, right? So we live in this concept of time, but what we're doing is we're actually giving over, if you want to think of it metaphysically, we're giving over our power to this idea. In other words, we're abdicating our own control of our lives in a sense because we're saying we're subject to time when there is no time. Time is relative. Time is not even relative except in the fact that it's in meeting that life is experienced. It's in interactions that life becomes real. Now, at the conscious level, this kind of makes sense, but yet it doesn't make sense, too. Because if it was true that the only real reality is what we're doing as we encounter, as we interact, both at subatomic level and at the cellular and social level, then we're not doing a very good job of it, right? You know, the last week, this news that came out about the protest and how it went wild on viral media and with the Covington High School kids and the Native American Nathan Phillips being there protesting and the black Hebrew Israelites. And it kind of all got out of hand. And then when you saw what you saw online, you sort of already made up your mind about what you were seeing. And then there were interviews afterwards that were trying to describe what actually happened. But here's the interesting thing. We think that's a thing. We think that's a thing that happened and we know what it means. And Carlo Rovelli, in an interview with Krista Tippett, had this really fascinating thing he said. He said, the biggest thing we can say about science is that we don't know stuff. Even the idea that we're right now where we are with quantum mechanics, it's just a theory. We like it. But he said, I'm pretty sure we're going to disprove this somewhere down the line as we learn more. But how quickly we make up our minds about stuff, right? How quickly we decide what's going on. And why do we do that? I mean, we give so much power without taking control of how we interact one with another. Why do we do that so quickly and so easily? It's part of our biology. We've talked about it so many times. It's our fear and fight and flight kind of responses that are part of our biology. It's part of our biases that we bring to every single encounter, that if we're not conscious, if we're not thinking about these things, if there's not some level of humility and curiosity, we go right past it to what we assume we see and decide upon that. The two most important or two most significant biases that we have are negativity bias. Do you know that's basically because we see things in terms of fear or anxiety or stress, including the fact that we age, we see things negatively. The second bias, because it feeds right into that, is confirmation bias. We look for familiarity. We look to confirm what we feel. The only way to combat these things is to begin to question and to begin to look for wider possibilities. Or what even is better, not so much wider, what's behind it, what's beneath it. You know, it occurred to me as I was watching this video and some of the interviews, nobody ever made the strong observation that you had a huge population in terms of the population there. The majority of the population was all related to testosterone. It was all hormones. The only person probably centered in a wider consciousness was Nathan Phillips, the Native American who had tradition, years and years and generations of tradition, and even he was rooted in some sense of bias. But he had some sense of being rooted, whereas everyone else was acting out of negativity and out of hormones. Everybody else. Now, anyone there, I'm surprised the teacher didn't think about this, but anyone there could have done half a dozen things to diffuse the situation immediately, right? And they didn't do that, and we know you could have walked away, could have been silent, could have, any number of things they could have done to just diffuse that. But instead, it escalated, and then it escalated socially because we're in a culture now that is feeding off of one of its most powerful biases, and that's negativity bias. And if we're not conscious about it, we'll eat it up because our brain loves it. It's what we're basically designed to do, run from tigers or stand and fight them, until we get old enough to know better. And then we just avoid the tigers altogether. I hear there's tigers over there. Not going. So this idea, though, of this wider consciousness. Here, David Lynch has a great little book. It's called Catching the Big Fish. You know, David Lynch is the guy who created Twin Peaks and Eraserhead and an interesting character. And he wrote this little book, Catching the Big Fish. In it, he says, the problem with creativity and the problem with creative response in life, he says, because all of life is art. I love how he says this. He says, all of life is art. He says, I had a friend once who wanted to carve me something, and I didn't have any clay or anything. I gave him 2 bars of soap. And I said, come back with what you got. And it was fascinating. He came back with a couple of rings that were together. He came back with a small little animal, he said. But then he said, he looked at him and he said, you know why that worked? It's because you realize art is a process of removing. Art is a process of peeling away. It's not a process of I have to create something perfect. It's a process of seeing what's there. And it may not work the first time, may not work the second time, but it's the process of taking things apart. So is consciousness. And David Lynch said that part of the problem with our consciousness is we approach it basically with what we got started with, which is about the size of a ping pong. So if we look at the world with a ping pong-sized consciousness, we see only a ping pong view. But to get a wider consciousness, you have to pull things apart. You have to take things and unlayer them and get to something deeper, something perhaps that we're not seeing immediately. Yesterday when I was attending a writers' conference, after the end, a friend of mine who was leading this conference introduced me. I wasn't speaking. She just said, I'm so glad Tom McDermott's here. I said, well, that's okay. I'm nice. I'm glad to be here. And then she said, Tom is a writer. I've written a couple of children's books. That's fine. She said, Tom plays and plays an instrument. He's a musician. I said, yeah. Then she said, he's also a minister. Suddenly, my reality changed. My presence there in their eyes changed completely. And it wasn't like I wasn't happy that she said it, but then I thought, well, I have to kind of open this up because they're going to label me immediately as what they think I am. And so she said, who's done a podcast? And I said, I've done a podcast. I got a friend that I do a podcast with. It's called Flying to Pay. We designed, it's kind of like we like to get underneath things. We drink beer and deconstruct Christianity. Now I had a whole new identity. And so afterwards, people were coming up to me, and so I'm like, they were telling me their faith story because they're Christian writers, and they wanted to tell me their faith story. And then someone would come up, but then when you said deconstructing Christianity, that really upset me. And so suddenly, and they started kind of defending themselves. Now, my initial response is, how do I get away from this? Okay, I find someone else to, look towards me to save me from the conversation, and I move aside, or I sit with it and then ask them, well, tell me what that means to you. When you say that we can always turn to God for the answers, tell me what that means to you. And then tell me more what that looks like. And then keep unpacking it, and we find out we are a piece of art together. We find out we're not that different. We find out we've got a place. Now, we're not going to get there that quickly because, again, our brains are what they are. They're these amazing, unconscious automatic systems that go right back to where we're comfortable. But for a moment, we peeled back the layers of soap, and we got to something possible at the core. That was an interaction. And the challenge for us, I think, as Christians, as people of faith, as people in a spiritual journey, seekers, is to remain seekers, is to remain humble with enough humility to realize the only time we have, if we want to measure time, is that this moment. But not just this moment, these encounters are what make life real. One last little image here before we start with have communion together. I was talking to a friend who said to me, he was describing his day, a clergy person, and this was last week, and he said, this was the wildest day today. He said, I was down the hall at the hospital, and I was visiting a family, and their son he's in a coma. He'd been in a horrible accident. It was a difficult time to be there. I was just trying to be present. I was just trying to be there to hold the pain. And he said, but Tom, and then I had to go down the hall and around the corner into this other unit over the women's unit, and then I was celebrating a birth of a baby. And I was celebrating a birthday. And he said, I left this morning. I said, I was just trying to hold all of this. And I said, yeah, that's a wild day. And he said, no, a lot of days are like that. He said, a lot of days are like that. And then he said, but I was walking down the hallway when something suddenly hit me because I wasn't defining my moment. Essentially, he didn't say this, but essentially he wasn't defining his moment by those two opposites. He stood in the hallway and he said, I suddenly realized we don't live here or there. We live in the hallways. That's our reality. We live in the hallways. And then things connect, and then things disconnect, and then things reconnect, but we never forget we're living in the hallways. And that's where we find each other as we move along.